shaping mechanism. I would always call oligarchs shadow actors. So they are indirect players in domestic politics and economy, and in some cases they are even able to capture power in the state or capture power in some branches of economy. Obviously, the model of oligarchic influence in post-Soviet states. In Ukraine, there has always been some balance between various oligarchic factions and state power on the other hand. But for instance, if we take a Moldovan case, until very recently it represented a classical case of state capture with a de facto merger between economic power and political power. And I think that recent reshaping of power in this country actually has not changed the situation. In Russia, it's also a very interesting case. We have a symbiosis between the Kremlin and the oligarchs. After so-called Yukos affair of 2003, the previous system of relations between the Kremlin and oligarchs were fundamentally revised. And now we have a system of informal licensing. So if you want to be an oligarch, or if you want to preserve your position as an oligarch, you have to get a special license from the Kremlin. So a close symbiosis between the political power and economic power in Russia. As I said before, we also have interesting, I don't have time to speak about it longer, but there are also interesting cases of oligarchic influence in some Central European countries. Czech Republic is, for example, a very interesting case. The richest Czech citizen is the Prime Minister, Mr. Babiš, of this country, with all the consequences for the situation. In case of Ukraine, which I think is one of the most interesting, it's my favorite. The oligarchs have been able to maintain their status as important players in Ukrainian politics thanks to a number of factors. And here I would like to recall a very interesting study which was made by Deloitte. Sometimes ago they released a report, it's called Deloitte Central and Eastern Europe Top 500 report, which ranks the largest companies in Central Europe and Ukraine. And according to their data, which is very interesting I think, 60% of Ukrainian largest enterprises are controlled by a local Ukrainian private capital. And if you compare it to Poland, it's 29. Czech Republic 23, and less than 5% in Romania. At the same time, the share of foreign capital in the ownership structure of the Ukrainian companies consists just 12%. It's the lowest in the region. And just compare it to the situation in other countries, it's 54% in Poland, it's 64% in the Czech Republic, and it's 84% in Romania. So here is economic basis for actually the power of oligarchs in Ukraine. They control majority of Ukrainian largest enterprises. It's not all. It's not all explanation. There are some other factors. Obviously, the oligarchs here in Ukraine they gain so much influence because of the monopolization of some strategic sectors in the economy. I will just give a few examples. For example, we have an oligarchic monopoly in, for example, electric energy, coal mining, and both are controlled by DTEK, owned by Mr. Akhmetov. We have the media, gas distribution, which is Obuchazes, which are controlled by the Firtash Empire. We have oil refinery sector, owned by Uknafta, and you can read it as Mr. Konończuk. Obviously, many of the Ukrainian oligarchic groups also have additional powerful instruments vis-a-vis the political power. It's mainly their control over the media. And actually, almost 80% of Ukrainian TV market is controlled by just 4 oligarchs. It's Konończuk, it's Firtash, Akhmetov, and Dmytro. So obviously, the oligarchic system has many negative consequences for political and economic activities. And if you would like to ask a question why oligarchs emerged, what happened that the oligarchic system emerged in Ukraine, I would call 4 factors. It's first of all the weakness of the state, it's ineffectiveness of the state's public institution, it's endemic corruption, it's political party system that systems that are either inefficient or it's completely absent in a normal classical sense. And therefore, and I think it's also very important, I think that the oligarchs are rather a symptom of the crisis condition of the state rather than the direct cause of it. But at the same time, oligarchs, they are petrifying all weaknesses of the state, and one of the main obstacles to overcome this weakness. What is also really important in regards to the oligarchs, they are not interested in any changes. So they are for a proponent of a status quo always. So they are supporting the existing regime, and usually their most important concern is to how to have a good condition for their business development. The oligarchic system fossilizes the weakness of the state, and also in many cases make the system even weaker. Therefore, any successful modernization would mean a change to condition that had been previously favorable for the oligarchs. There are different types of impact the oligarchs have had in Ukraine, but also other post-Soviet states. I would call 5 the most important. I think it's limiting political pluralism, it's capturing state institutions, it's corruption, it's monopolizing some sectors of the economy, and last but not least is blocking reforms. This last point is probably crucial, the most important, because and we can actually observe it. We can take experience of last 5 years when some very fragmentary reforms after the Maidan revolution actually happened, and if we research it in details, then we can name that there was in some part lack of the political will, but also some resistance from some Ukrainian oligarchic groups. So the system is actually too strong to, at least at the time being, to break it down. And finally, we should ask probably a question how to live with the oligarchs, what we should do with the oligarchs. I think that the precondition to finding an effective resolution to the challenge posed by the oligarchs is to see a picture realistically and without illusions. And I fundamentally disagree with what Mr. Kuchar said in the first bundle. Reduction of power of the oligarchs and turning them in just big businessmen, which would be, I think, the ultimate goal of this process, the oligarchization, right? Depends mainly on effectiveness of, perhaps it's banal, but I think it's true. It's a question of effectiveness of a reform process. And again, I would name 5 crucial reforms from my point of view. It's first of all institutions. You have to have institutions if you want to counterbalance oligarchic influence, independent institutions. Secondly, partly compared to the first point, it's independent judiciary, which is exploited. It's like a weak judiciary or lack of independent judiciary is exploited by the oligarchs. Third is an effective fight with corruption, and here I would like to stress the word effective. Competition policy, it was also stressed in the first panel, it's extremely important. Competition monopoly and independent anti-monopoly committee. And last but not least, it's association agreements, especially DCFT implementation, which is I would say, great agenda for constructing independent institutions in Ukraine. So the future of oligarchy in Ukraine depends on the reforms I mentioned before. At the same time, unfortunately, I don't think that this process would be fast and easy, because of the resistance from the oligarchs and because of the instruments they have vis-à-vis the political power. But at the same time, it's a precondition. I believe it's a precondition for if Ukraine want to be a stable, successful country, it's just a must. Obviously, there would be resistance from the oligarchic groups. So conflicts are just a matter of time, if there will be political will from the government to fight with the oligarchs. But again, it's possible to build a stable, effective state, and it's possible to develop small and middle-sized companies without transforming the oligarchs into just big businessmen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Working anymore. I was punished by oligarchs.
You can take it.
No, this is okay. It's working though. So thank you for the entering presentation. I have very short question. One question, because it's actually that you mentioned very interesting facts. So you mentioned Moldova, for example, for instance, Czech Republic. We can also add Georgia. So this is like, let's say, monopolistic oligarchic systems. But in terms of Ukraine, you mentioned that it's a very interesting case because we have a number of players. So does the structure of the oligarchy influence actually the behavior and influence how the country can live or how country can compete with oligarchy? What I mean, if you have a number of players, there is definitely the competition with them. And the competition can sometimes lead to some rules. Is it possible, if you're talking about oligarchs, because this is natural field for companies and for society that is developing itself on the basis of law, but is it possible that competition between multi-oligarchy players can lead to this win-win situation with the society?
I don't think so. In regards to your last points. Obviously, there are different types of oligarchic regime, if we may use the word regime, oligarchic system. Yeah. Obviously, there is a different one in the Czech Republic, different in Slovenia, and different in Ukraine. Paradoxically, there is pluralism thanks to the different oligarchic faction in this country, which not always have common interest, and always or often they have different interests. Some of them are pro-themselves, pro-oligarchic. Some of them are pro-Russian or are sponsored by Russian, like Mr. Filter, for example. But I think that the harsher model of oligarchic regime is when the oligarchy is a system. It's the most complicated to fight with. And I'm afraid it's the case of Ukraine.
Okay, thank you so much. So we'll have time for discussion, but let us continue, and I want to give a...
One little thing. Mr. Firtash is not pro-Russian. Mr. Firtash is pro-Mr. Firtash. He had a fantastic relationship with Yushchenko. He worked with Yushchenko and with Yanukovych throughout his presidency.
Yeah, I agree. But at the same time, he was sponsored in the past, and today also by Gazprom Bank and other Russian institutions.
Yeah, for sure. But I think that you're quite right about that. Every oligarchy is pro-oligarchy. Yeah. That is the start of the point.
Including Trump.
Including Trump, yeah. But let us continue. So I want to give the floor to Professor Yuriy Matsiyevsky. And I want to ask about actually the nature of the Ukrainian oligarchy. So how can it be possible that after the crash of the Soviet Union, the people who have never, or at least limited, reflection and property rights turned out to be very successful oligarchs in a few years?
Okay, thank you. I will go straight to this question, but let me first start with some more general observations. And my task will be easier because Wojciech already covered most of my talk and I will just specify on some points. We will not talking before, so we are just thinking in the same way. I will probably stand here, it will be easier for me to navigate the presentation. My question is why the competing oligarchy has not led to viable democracy in Ukraine. The actual question that just Dmytro asked us. And let me just start from a couple of observations. First question, what kind of regime do we have in Ukraine? There is a typical assumption that we have an oligarchic regime. I would rather call and agree with Taras, it's better to call system, meaning that the system, this is how it works. A regime is, there are different perspectives of course, but from my perspective, regime is first and foremost institutions. People, actors, important. But this is the set of formal and informal institutions that determine the actor's behavior. And from that perspective, we can call Ukrainian regime a hybrid one, which is a specific mixture of formal, weak formal institutions and much more stronger informal institutions that stipulate or govern actors' behavior. And then the oligarchy is often perceived as the source of all evil, which is a major impediment to reforms. This is true, but only partially true. Let me just explain why. Sorry. This is what I trying to this is just what I said. Now let us look at the sources of oligarchy. This is the question that Dmytro asked us at the very beginning. I agree with Wojciech, but I will add two other factors. Rapid structural change that Ukraine was facing at the beginning of the 90s. This is dramatic changes, the systemic transformation from Soviet society into something new. And that was the possibility for the few, for very entrepreneurial few, who were able to capture the state. The phrase already was used, and I will also use it later. And I agree with Wojciech, the absence of strong legal institutions. That was paralegal environment, which allows very porous environment in legal terms. So this is actually allowed for a couple of people to appear at the early 90s. Anders Sassman, for example, is telling us that oligarchs appeared in Ukraine around 1994. Oleg Havrilishin, Canadian economist, is saying that they were already there even during the Konończuk presidency, but they were invisible at that time because they were too tiny and small. And after 1994, when the Kuchma came to power, and after first privatizations, so they just manifest themselves. And these first oligarchs were they were Yuriy Zahilsky, Vadim Rabinovich, Yuriy. So they went into business back into 1991 after the law on cooperatives was adopted in Ukraine. Let me just put some emphasis on the nature of oligarchy. I will agree also with Wojciech, but I think the essence also is that extracting rent from the state resources by using political power, by using political influence. And completely agree, this is the resisting to systemic reforms. So I'm turning to the idea of state capture, that this notion, this concept was coined by Joel Hellman in 1998, I believe. He was at that time one of the World Bank advisor, and they did a report on East Central Europe, and they found that by the 1998, second half of the 90s, Ukraine was about top 10 countries that businesses have major influence on political decisions, and they call it state capture. So from that time on, Ukraine is being in the hands of oligarchs. These hands were changing, but the actual mechanism was working in the way. But now we have a situation. We have a competing situation, which is absolutely different from Russian one, and from many others, from Central Asian states. So we have a competing oligarchy. And I was putting the questions at the front of representation why this situation did not lead to more viable competitive democracy. There was an assumption there that competing oligarchy would lead to some sort of deadlock, lose-lose for everyone. So in order to avoid that situation, oligarchs would have had to agree to play by the rules. But actually they didn't. And the events of 2004, 2014 prove us that the oligarchs are still there and they don't want to play by the rules. And the why. So now we have some, and this is my sort of theorizing how we can talk about this. I begin with the lack of legal institutional stimuli. Also some sort agreeing that weak rule of law and the situation with the porous legal system allows those players to not follow rules, I'd say. So the lack of laws like antitrust legislations, these very important laws that make American rubber barons normal businessmen, property right protections also is very important, offshore taxations, assets legalizations. So this is a major reforms that we need, they were not accepted in Ukraine, and that enabled them to play without rules. And here is the conceptual map of how we get to the situation when the status was captured. Weak legal environment or absence of weak rule of law bring us to the high uncertainty. This is unpredictability of political decisions and predictable deals. This is the lack of credible commitments, meaning that businessmen were not sure that their treaties will be enforced. And this leads to the secrecy and behind-the-scene agreements. This is the major, I'd say, the major modus operandi of oligarchic regime, oligarchic system, how the deals are made. And I call them bad pacts. And this is different from the good pacts, which opened the way to democratization in most of East Central Europe. Why they are bad? Because they are secret. The decisions are taken not in the interest of the people, but in the interest of the few. And the worst of them, they are not followed also. These pacts are also broken by the same players. So, and they are interested in preserving the status quo, meaning that they are interested in keeping the state captured. And what can be done? So the general idea is to strengthen institutions. And again, I completely agree with Wojciech here, and the strengthening rule of law. So the goal would be to separate business from politics. But now let me just stress a couple of points. How can we get there? And I believe Parliament is a central institution. Why I believe that? Because this is the Parliament that could enable those laws that we don't have in Ukraine at the moment. But how can we change Parliament? I mean, we need there at least 50% reformers to be able to enforce legislations. But the entry barrier to change the Parliament would be the change to electoral law. You know that the electoral law is passed, but the president vetoed the one. So this is very, very significant symptom showing that the president does not want the system to change. And if we would have this situation back in 2019, when we have pre-term elections, if we would have 50% of reformers in parliament, now we would have a completely different situation. And that's the major problem. If we sometime will have this situation, the parliament would be able to pass important systemic reform, and that would lead to the strengthening rule of law, and that would make more credible commitments of those business players who are there, and this meaning that they would opt to play by the rules, and the state will be somehow released from their hands. This is the way I see it at the moment. Saying this is ideal scheme. Many factors can contribute and many factors can dissuade this process, but this is look like a realistic alternative. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much please take your chair. And I would just have one short question, because indeed, this is a system, and we know how the system works, and how the oligarchy cycle is working, yeah? So, because for elections, you definitely need some money, and this is obvious. And if you have the concentration of power and cost in one hand, they usually buy these deputies who actually come into the parliament and then observing some rules and protecting the laws that are good for the oligarchy regime. You mentioned it would be good definitely to change the law, to change the electoral law, to make some quotation, but how it's possible? So my question is simple, how it's possible to break it when you have this cycle that is working for the year? So what should we start? Because we see that if members of parliament are not interested to simply to cut these rules, what is the beginning? So what is the first step? Who should do that?
Well, elections, and elections, or revolution. We had one a couple of years ago, but that was a bloody event. And I would not encourage students here, sitting here, to think about revolution in that term. We better go to the polling stations and vote for the people who you trust and change the system from within, from behind. There is no other way. So we need to change it by electoral way. We cannot just to take power, grab power. As Ukraine was always accused by Russia that there was a coup in Kiev. So, no way that.
Okay, thank you for that. So, you said that the ball is now on the part of the society, and yeah, definitely, I like your idea of trust. That was really important, like to institutionalize this trust in the Ukrainian society. And here I come to the actually to the talk of Professor Kuzio, because yeah, the revolution of dignity itself was actually the revolution, or at least an attempt to have this trust. Yeah, and today's university, I'm talking about the dignity, about the trust, about the responsibility, and about the input that everybody is doing, and to actually to reform, to act, and to take this responsibility. But anyway, we see that these old schemes or mechanisms or structures, they simply left during the Poroshenko regime. That was one of the major questions for the electoral choice to take somebody who is out of politics, who used to be very green and new, instead of these, let's say, old schemes. So why this trust was not achieved? So, and actually, is it possible right now that we can skip all these schemes? So I'll give you a floor, please.
Thank you. Well, Ukraine used to be a drama, now it's a comedy show. That's a new joke in Ukraine. Nobody, I think, one of the things we should, I'll just say right at the beginning, and it's a consequence of hearing other people talk today, is that we should understand that the origins of oligarchs are not always the same. A lot of people have called them criminals, etc., etc. But I think it's good to differentiate between oligarchs who emerged from organized crime, Akhmetov, for example, who have blood on their hands, most likely. That is why he is the only oligarch who hired American lawyers to try and prevent journalists and academics like me, they came after me, for example, to prevent writing about his past. Akhmetov does not tell you what he did between 85 and 95. It's a complete blank in his biography. And there are other oligarchs who emerged as white-collar criminal oligarchs, I would call them, and we have them in the West. So they use, like for example, Pinchuk, who used his family connections to become rich, but nobody's ever said that, for example, Poroshenko or Tihipko or Pinchuk have blood on their hands. So it's very, very important to differentiate between those two groups because they have different mentalities, very different mentalities. But no, we don't do that enough. I'd like to talk about oligarchs in terms of dividing it up into 5 groups, as 5 factors. Firstly, the influence on the economy, and I won't really talk about that much because that's already been talked about. Secondly, rule of law, which I think is important. Thirdly, media. Fourthly, parties and elections. And fifth, offshore tax havens. Now, I go straight jump into Mr. Zelensky, President Zelensky, sorry, he's now no longer Mr. He could be successful in the area of the economy, the kind of things we've already heard, demonopolization, but his big contribution to change, if it's going to happen, is going to be in the area of institutions and rule of law. And here I do not see him as a revolutionary. I just kind of disagree with many speakers today, including my colleagues, because I think Zelensky would then be just continuing some positive work done under Poroshenko. I think it's wrong to say that nothing happened under Poroshenko that was good, and that's a mistake. If anything, there were some positive areas, like in the creation of anti-corruption institutions, which were not used by him, but which now Zelensky has inherited. And here, Zelensky no longer has an excuse. He now has a majority in the Ukrainian parliament, so he can't blame them for blocking his fight against corruption. And he now has an anti-corruption court, which is a nice present he got from Poroshenko. But the danger is, of course, selective use of justice, like under Yanukovych. The true sign of an anti-corruption fighter isn't somebody going after an opponent, it's somebody putting somebody in jail from your own group. So if he was to put Konończuk in jail, then he would be generally an anti-corruption fighter. But if he goes after Poroshenko, I'm sorry, this is not really a sign of anti-corruption. But I don't think Zelensky is going to have much impact on changing or reducing oligarch influence on the media. And I would disagree with my colleagues about political parties. One of the problems that West Ukrainians like to say they're different from East Ukrainians. Well, you are, but you're also very similar to East Ukrainians in that you cannot create political parties. And that's a legacy of the Soviet regime. The whole post-Soviet space has problems with creating political parties, which makes them different from Central Eastern Europe, where often you inherited pre-communist political structures, or for example, the Communist Party became the Social Democratic Party, like maybe in Poland. But in Ukraine, you've had, and I've worked with Western foundations who tried to help Ukraine build political parties, and it's been a failure. You have 5 political projects in the Ukrainian parliament, all tied to a leader. Well, sorry, 4 tied to a Ukrainian leader, 1 tied to a Russian leader. So that means that there'll always be the temptation, the danger of oligarch-backed election projects. So I'm not sure I would see much change happening there. On the question of TV, well, I have zero problem as an individual if the Ukrainian state was to nationalize these TV channels, take them away from oligarchs. But I can imagine the outcry in Europe and elsewhere that this is a threat against media freedom, etc., etc. So what do you really do about them? And they are crucially important. Why? Give the example of the Poroshenko era. Again, one of the myths that he was somehow in bed with oligarchs. The 2 biggest channels in Ukraine, 1+1 and Interchannel, attacked Poroshenko for practically 5 years running. They were hostile to him for 5 years running. And they created, I think they partly contributed to the climate which led to the high vote for anti-establishment populist Zelensky. But nothing's changed, everything's terrible, everything's bad. And that, how do you deal with that, realistically deal with that problem? I mean, I'm throwing this as a question out. The other area I don't see how Zelensky can really change much is, sadly, the old question of offshore tax corruption. It's always, as a British person, it's always fun to talk about these things in front of European Union officials. British people love to make fun of European Union officials. It's one of our pastimes. And you know, the problem with corruption is that everybody says it's over there. It's never here. It's hilarious to hear Trump say the corruption's in Ukraine when he's the most corrupt president in US history. So the problem with corruption is that there are two parts to it. Where it comes from, where it's stolen, and where it's sent to. But debates and discussions of corruption only talk about the first part, never about the second part. And the destination for corruption is many countries in the European Union. Cyprus is just a laundry machine for corruption. Londongrad, or Moscow on the Thames. Transparency International describes London as the biggest center for money laundering in the world. London, Britain. So, you know, that whole problem area of kind of dirty money being accepted in the West is something I'm not sure that a Ukrainian president has influence over. And I'll tell you how it works, giving the example which is currently in the news, Burisma. How this whole works. Zlochevsky should be in jail. But he's not in jail. Why? Because the Ukrainian prosecutor's office is a bordello. I've long talked that it should be closed down. It's a complete useless organization. And it's a center of corruption. It's where you go to buy off any criminal charges against you. And that's what Zlochevsky did. And that's why the Ukrainian prosecutor's office did not cooperate with an investigation into Zlochevsky in London, England. Then Zlochevsky exports his corruption to the West. He buys up think tanks in Washington. He hires the former Polish president, Mr. Kwasniewski. He cleans his money. So this is a two-way process, as it were, between both sides, sadly. And now Trump's involved. Let's see what, I mean, I think that I'm going to talk more about the recent period and to see where this leads to with Zelensky. In the Poroshenko era, two big oligarch groups were defanged, were reduced in power. The gas lobby, which is Firtash, Lovechkin, Boyko and Co., did lose political influence and lose their sources of money. They were always very pragmatic. Yes, Firtash is, together with Dmytro, the two main Russian agents in Ukraine. But at the same time, Firtash has worked closely with pro-Western political forces. But what happened was that Ukraine stopped importing gas directly from Russia. And Russia's biggest export is corruption and compromat. It's not gas. And if you import gas from Russia anywhere in Europe, you're also importing corruption and kind of compromat on politicians. Ukraine hasn't been doing that since late 2015, 2016. That severely hurt the gas lobby. And you saw that with the crisis and the split in the opposition bloc. And now the opposition platform has to be financed by Moscow, not by gas lobby money. The second group is Konończuk. He lost his two big sources of corrupt income, Ukernafta, which was given to him by Tymoshenko in 2009, and Privat Bank. Privat Bank cost a total of practically $12 billion. $6 billion he stole, and $6 billion that the Ukrainian state had to put in to rescue Privat Bank. Today, Privat Bank is a profit-making bank. It never was under Konończuk. And that is why Inter and 1+1 channels hated and went after Poroshenko. So again, you know, it's a very confused picture in the elections. It wasn't the case that Poroshenko was completely always in bed with all of the oligarchs. He was with some, but not with all of them. I think that but where the problem lies is that Poroshenko didn't do the full job, and this is why it led to the vote for Zelensky. And the source of that corruption is this nexus between the president, prosecutor's office, and SBU. And that's why I've, as I say, long called for the prosecutor's office to be closed down and its functions transferred elsewhere. This is a Soviet institution. You had 20,000 prosecutors in Ukraine, which is 3 times more than Britain, which has a population of 30 million more. what did they do? They just were paid bribes to close down corruption cases. That's all it ever did. And so I think with Zelensky inheriting that model, if he keeps that model, there's always a temptation to continue down that road of using those institutions for your own personal benefit as opposed to fighting corruption. Although he's going to have it more difficult now. Why? Because Ukrainians are not Russians. Kuchma told us that many years ago in his well-known book that nobody's read, I don't think. That Ukrainians are impatient. They want to see heads on spikes. They want to see people in jail, and elites in jail. And so if there are no elites going to jail by next year, Zelensky's popularity will, I think, collapse, will decline a lot. The red lines, the dangers. I read a very good article here in Ukrainski, Ukrainian Week on the way here, and it said the difference between Zelensky and Poroshenko. Unlike Poroshenko, who was a micromanager, Zelensky he's just a franchise for players with different interests in a conglomerate that can be hardly called a team. And you see very many different influences there, including Konończuk and Dmytro in particular. I was at the Alta European Strategy in September in Kiev, and during the lunch break, Konończuk walked in protest, the American ambassador walked out because there were criminal charges against him in the United States. This, to some people, resembles the Akhmetov-Firtash influence under Yanukovych. Will Zelensky go after Konończuk as the IMF is demanding? Will he allow Konończuk? Konończuk wants revenge against Poroshenko, and he wants his private bank back. And of course, these are red lines for the West. And I suspect that Konończuk's new pro-Russian stance is because he thinks if Ukraine becomes pro-Russian, then you can ignore what the IMF say, and then you can maybe give me back private bank. To conclude, Zelensky potential area of success is in the areas of economy, demonopolization, those areas, rule of law, maybe for the first time in Ukrainian history that elites will not be above the law, that everybody will be equal before the law. Hopefully there will be no selective use of justice, but media, political parties and offshore zones, I'm not very hopeful that those areas can be changed very much.